In this video, Jordan Peterson explains the process of behaving in a certain way when you become aware of something.
So what happened with regards to Sokolov and Vinogradova, there was a whole flurry of ideas that their research generated. A lot of that was among artificial intelligence investigators. And what they basically concluded was that the way that creatures worked in the world was that they produced expectancy maps of how the world would lay itself out when they acted in a particular way. And then they would transform the model internally. This is probably how you think you think. They transform the model internally and make a prediction about what the outcome of their behavior would be. And then they would manifest that behavior. So the idea is stimulus. First of all, the idea was stimulus response. And that's actually true if you don't go much above the spine. So the behaviors were right about that. There are deterministic levels at which the nervous system operates, or roughly deterministic. But as the amount of brain tissue increases, as the number of processing interfaces increases, the number of neural connections between stimulus and response increase, the idea that it's deterministic starts to fall apart because it's complex chain networks of activity between the action, or the stimulus and the action. But there are circuits that are really simple. It's just one neuron or two neurons, and those things are super fast, and you need them. If you're going to jump out of the way of a snake, for example, you don't want to be sitting there thinking about snakes. It's like you want your eyes to activate your spinal cord, so you jump to the side, and that's not conscious. It's like it's way too fast to be conscious. So, and we've conserved all those, archaic systems because we need to be fast, and you can model the way those archaic systems work by using the standard tenets of behaviorism. And you can get quite a long way doing that, but you can't get everywhere. And so the mapping idea that I'm describing is, in part, it's the entrance of cognition into behaviorism. It's part of it. It was more complicated than that, but it was part of it. So, and that kind of makes sense. I suspect that's the way you think. You see something, you think about what it is, you figure out what you're going to do, and then you do it. And then it either works, in which case that's great for everyone, or it doesn't work, and then you have an orienting reflex. That was their basic idea. And it's a pretty smart idea. It turns out to be wrong in many complicated ways, and I can't even tell you exactly why it's wrong, although I do know that part of the reason that it's wrong is that it turns out that it's way more complicated to produce these damn models than anybody thought. Because the behaviorists at that point, and Sokolov and Vinogradova were behaviorists, they kind of had this implicit idea, you think, stimulus, response. Now, in between that, there's a black box, right? That's whatever the brain is doing. They didn't care about that because they didn't think you had to take it into consideration. But there's still two other elements of that theory. One element is there is a stimulus. Another element is there is a response. Well, we won't go into the response part yet, but we will go into the stimulus part. It's like, let's say that you look at someone attractive and your heart rate increases. Okay, what's the stimulus? Exactly. The person? The person's eyes? The way their eyes are configured in relationship to the rest of their face, odor, shape, context. What's the stimulus? And the answer is, well, who the hell knows? Because figuring out what the stimulus is turns out to be hard. And the behaviorists, they just pretended that, no, everything was made out of homogeneous blocks. And when you looked at them, there they were. And that was the stimulus, roughly speaking. So they pretended. They got rid of having to consider the complexity of the brain. Remember, half your damn cortex is devoted to seeing. Turns out that seeing is very difficult. The behaviorists they finessed that by just pretending it wasn't a problem. They just assumed the stimulus was given. So it was like, there's the box. There's a picture of the box on your retina. That picture is translated into the little guy inside your head, and then he figures out how to move your arms. It's like, well, that's not right. It's not right because it's very difficult to specify the stimulus. It's extraordinarily difficult. And that's part of the reason why it's taken so long to develop artificial intelligence. You can't teach the damn things to see. And that's because there's no edges, there's no lines, there's no primary objects. All of that is something that our brain constructs for us on the fly instantaneously. So we think it's just there. But some of you have probably played with Photoshop trying to adjust an image, eh? It's like, are there lines in that image? Are there edges? It's like, not at all. You increase the resolution, it just turns into a mass of pixels that are fundamentally indistinguishable from one another. Like if you take a photograph of someone and you try to cut them out and put them against a different background, what you find right away is that you end up with this cutout looking thing because you're trying to make something into a manipulable object that's segregated from the world that actually isn't represented that way in the photograph at all. You might see it that way, and in fact you do. But if you start to play with the representation, you find that it's pixels all the way down. And so it's very hard. And Photoshop is pretty damn sophisticated. It'll do edge detection for you, you know, but it's kind of rough. It's not enough to fool your eyes. So it's hard to see things. So that's actually one of the places where behaviorism, which we will talk more about, started to fall apart. It was like, turns out the problem of the stimulus is like way more complicated than we thought. And then it also turned out that the problem of the behavior was way more complicated. So let's say you train a rat to run down a runway, eh? And the way you do that is you take the rat and you make sure he's hungry. Skinner's rats, B.F. Skinner, he was like the dean of behaviorism, his rats were starved to 75% of their body weight. So a Skinnerian rat was a weird rat. It was really lonesome and isolated, and it was starving. And so you could kind of treat it like a one-dimensional entity, right? Because it would do anything for food. So it was an extraordinarily hungry rat, and then it was also an isolated rat. So it was a simplified model of an actual rat, and that's a simplified model of a human being. And you know, you might think that I'm not very fond of the idea that you can model human beings with rats, but I'm actually extremely fond of it because a rat is a way better model of who you are than your model of who you are is a model of who you are. You know, so a rat is a lot more like you than your thought of you is like you. And rats, like, give the guys some credit, man. Those things are smart. You know, and they are like us in many, many, many ways, many important ways. So you can get a long way with a rat. And I think I told you at the beginning of this class is like part of the pharmacology that a lobster uses to determine its position in a dominance hierarchy is the same pharmacology that you use. So, you know, you're quite a bit like a lobster, but you're even more like a rat. So that's enough compliments for one day.